Hello, my name is Edmund DeMarsh. I'm the editor of the Trends Journal. I'm here today with Chay Bowes. He's the Irish journalist working in Russia. You might see his work on Russia's RT and in other independent outlets out there or international outlets. Chay, thank you so much for joining the Trends Journal today. We appreciate your expertise on the Russia meeting today in Alaska.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Always a pleasure to join you.
Thank you. First and foremost, I'd like to just get started. Sergey Lavrov raised some eyebrows. He got some people talking on X today because he arrived at the meetings wearing a Cccp shirt today. Is Sergey Lavrov right now playing 4D chess, or why would he choose that to wear to the meeting today, or at least arrive?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's kind of good humor, I'd say, but it's very common to see people in Russia wearing, and it's actually what looks like CCCP to someone speaks English. It's actually SSSR in Russian, in Cyrillic. So it means, the old Soviet Union, the USSR, basically. But it looks like CCCP, but it's actually the SSSR. Okay, so that's the first thing I'd say. And you can see this stuff everywhere here in Russia, in Moscow. People are very fond. They recall the Soviet Union with great, emotion and, some regret, of course. I mean, I'm not suggesting anybody really wants to return to the Soviet Union, but it is something that's held with great fondness here. I mean, we remember Vladimir Putin saying that the biggest tragedy that ever befell Russia was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And a lot of people feel that, this was a very terrible time. And in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia went through a horrendous period of, crime, massive organized crime, societal decay, collapse, addiction. It was a very dangerous and very tragic place to live. And of course, when Vladimir Putin came along, he inherited this really chaotic society, which he's been credited very widely here and by objective observers in the West with actually fixing a lot of the problems that were endemic here. So I would say it's a mixture of Sergei Lavrov just being Sergei Lavrov. He likes to smoke a cigarette. He's kind of he has this reputation for being grumpy and gruff, but he's a 50-year veteran diplomat member. He's probably one of the most widely recognized and qualified diplomats in the world. He started his diplomatic career 50 years ago, I think, in what is now Sri Lanka, which was then Ceylon. He speaks Sinhalese. He's a real veteran, this guy. So, yeah, to say he doesn't know what he's doing or it was an accident, I don't know. But, by the way, you can buy that shirt for 20 bucks here in Moscow, so it's not something very expensive. So I'd say it's a little bit of patriotism, a little bit of a troll, and maybe it was just when he threw on in the morning, who knows?
I saw you on with George Galloway, and you spoke about that you didn't have high expectations for any kind of major uh, moment out of these meetings. And also, your opinion was shared by others. I just want to read what Jeffrey Sachs, he told this to Judge Andrew Napolitano's Judging Freedom this week. He said, Trump isn't in control the way that he thinks that he is. He said maybe he's in control of the DC police force right now, which took over this morning. But when it comes to the rest of the world, we have a military industrial complex, which is a war machine, and Trump has not demonstrated any capacity to bring that under control. That's what he said during an interview with Napolitano.
Yeah.
If why would Trump go through such lengths and meet with the Russian delegation and meet with Putin today if he didn't think there was going to be a deal? Why? I don't understand the political side of that.
Yeah,
Do you
well,
have any
it's an
take on that?
interesting point, and I'd agree with the judge, and I'd agree, or sorry, with Jeffrey Sachs. I had a very interesting dinner last night here in Moscow with Scott Ritter and Rick Sanchez. We had a fascinating discussion. Of course, this is all we're talking about is what if. And I suppose there's two reasons I suppose Mr. Trump would arrive in Alaska. The first one is something Dmitry Peskov, who is Vladimir Putin's press officer or spokesman here, has always said all along, there's no point in the two presidents meeting unless there's something to talk about. That's the first thing. I don't think the Russians will be going to Ankara unless there was the bones of a deal, or at least a scaffold and I've said this continually, that there has to be some sort of scaffold. This is what we're going to talk about. These are the issues that we disagree on, and this is what we have to agree with. I would imagine that's the format. The other reason could be, for a more cynical person, might suggest that, and this is addressed in your statement on the military-industrial complex. You have to understand that in Germany, for example, when the news of a meeting between President Trump and President Putin broke, shares in Rheinmetall dropped by about 15%. And Rheinmetall is the biggest defense contractor in Europe. And the shares fell off the cliff. So if that's not almost systemic evidence of how the military-industrial complex predates on conflict, particularly the war in Ukraine, the European Union recently said that they want to spend 800 billion euros of European taxpayers' money on rearming Europe. This idea. So you've got Germany, who has a little bit of a history with rearming, aggressively now, almost changing its constitution to say that it can rearm and become the leading military in Europe. So you have to understand, this is a very real thing, the nexus between the military-industrial complex and the political elites in Europe. And the political elites in Europe, as you've seen, with the latest meeting between von der Leyen and Starmer and Mr. Trump, are completely supplicant and vassal to Washington. They don't have any real political independence. Whatever Washington said goes in Europe. That's the reality. They don't say, oh no, we're all sovereign. That is the reality. So the other reason to follow on would be that Mr. Trump could attend a meeting and say, look, come out and say Mr. Putin is completely intransient. He wants the 4 Oblasts, which I've said they want. He wants recognition of Crimea. He wants basically a post-World War I Germany in Ukraine, a reduced military, a neutered ability to cause any offensive assaults against Russia, rights for Russian indigenous people regarding language and religion, and he wants it all rubber stamped by the United Nations. So if he can walk out of that meeting saying, look, I am the peace president, I've done everything I can, but Vladimir is completely intransigent. And that's despite the fact that Vladimir Putin has said the same thing since the night he made a speech announcing the special military operation in Ukraine. The same things have been said consistently by the Russian side. They can never change what they say has to happen in order for there to be peace in Ukraine. And there's absolutely no point in Russia agreeing to a ceasefire while its army advances rapidly. The Russian army is advancing at a rate now greater than at any other time since the beginning of this conflict, or this phase of the conflict in 2022. Remember that. The Ukrainian military has no men. It's a collapsing front in the east. So I find it hard to believe that they're meeting for no reason. What the rationale about that meeting could be, and the reason, it could be different on both sides. I don't think the Russians are in any way naive. But I think the key factor that we have to look at and recognize is, I believe that Vladimir Putin goes into these negotiations trying to end the war and achieve the goals that he set for the Russian Federation when they committed to this very serious, intervention in Ukraine. This is not something that was taken lightly. It's cost a lot of lives in Russia, a lot of men, treasure, material. It's caused pain in Russia. Okay, let's not ever try to diminish that. I believe Vladimir Putin goes into these negotiations sincerely representing Russia. I think Mr. Trump goes into the negotiations representing the Republic of Donald Trump, which means he wants a Nobel Peace Prize. He wants to feed his, very big ego. Now, I get into a lot of trouble for this. I think there's a lot of sincerity in Donald Trump. And people say, he can't be sincere. The Americans started the war in Ukraine. Of course they did. We know what happened in 2014. We know what happened prior to 2014, funding radical nationalists and Nazis in the post-war era in Ukraine, always trying to peel away the very bountiful Ukrainian SSR away from the Soviet Union. This isn't a new thing. But I do believe Mr. Trump is sincere about wanting it to end, but he's very naive about how it could end. He's getting terrible advice, and I've said this to Scott Ritter last night. Who is advising this man on the casualty rates? That 14 times more Russians are dying than Ukrainians. It's absolutely ludicrous. So you really would have to wonder and worry about the level of competent awareness Mr. Trump has going into the meeting and what his motivations are to end the war. Now, for me, I don't really mind what the motivation is once it ends. The vast majority of people here in Russia want the war over. As any sentient society would. Nobody wants the war. Nobody wanted this war in the first place in Russia. This is another completely manufactured reality in the West that the Russians wanted to invade somebody. So they just picked the biggest country, the biggest land army full of Russian speakers with these, immensely historic links, cultural, historical, over centuries. That they just picked Ukraine to invade. And Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania are next. It's just ludicrous. This was not undertaken lightly by the Russians. But the key sense here in Russia is no deal is better than a bad deal now. The Russians don't want their children and grandchildren maybe to have to fight this war again. So I go back to what I've been saying, banging the drum. The Russians made it very clear what has to happen in Ukraine for this war to go away. Because the United States would not tolerate an anti-American regime in Mexico, which was torturing, attacking and assaulting Americans and English speakers along the border and taking weapons from China and Russia and pointing them into America. That would have been ended by the 82nd Airborne overnight. So in the real politic of people like the great John Mearsheimer, great powers don't tolerate existential threats on their borders. And whether you agree or disagree, this war will only end two ways: by agreement, where Russia gets the guarantees and safety that it wants from this, the four oblasts, recognition of Crimea, a demilitarized Ukraine, no NATO for Ukraine, no NATO troops in Ukraine, or Russia will insist on that on the battlefield. And they're winning on the battlefield. It will mean more pain, more death. It will mean more stress for the Russian economy. But I think the Russians go into these negotiations knowing that we're willing to either finish this at the table or on the battlefield.
You mentioned John Mearsheimer, and before the elections, I saw him give an interview, and he mentioned that he thought that Trump would keep the status quo going in Ukraine, because he said Russia just is asking too much, and Trump doesn't want to look like the president who capitulated to Russia. So his estimation back then, and like you said before, it seems that Russia really hasn't changed any of its goals, or it looks like it's unbending on those certain key points. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting to me on how Trump will try to present any kind of agreement with Russia without looking like he's the president who lost Ukraine, because I'm sure that's playing on Trump's mind too. And also, I wanted to ask you, right after Trump announced the meeting, Europe, the main countries in Europe, the UK, France, and Germany, they issued their own statement saying that they will not accept anything without Ukraine at the table when it comes to territory. So do you see, if there is some kind of a breakthrough, and this is a stretch, if there is a breakthrough in Alaska, do you see Europe becoming a major issue in preventing any kind of progress? Could Europe take over where the U.S. left off? Let's say Trump says, hey, I got the deal. Now it's up to you. Do you see that potentially happening? Because it looks like Europe's on the same page as Zelensky in not wanting to give up any land. So I'd love to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah, well, some context regarding Europe. When Donald Trump was elected and the Biden administration was cleared out, there was a sense that Mr. Zelensky was in serious trouble. This absolute, no questions asked support, this unconditional 1,000-year support of Ukraine, which is a de facto dictatorship now. Mr. Zelensky, remember, was elected in 2019, and he was elected by a 70% plus margin, imagine, a huge landslide victory, because he promised he would end this simmering civil war in the East and end corruption. These were the two pillars on which Mr. Zelensky was elected. Imagine, we're nearly 6 years in now to his presidency, which should have been 5 years. No elections, brutality on the streets, terrible oppression of the media, of the opposition, of religious minorities, brutality among the security services. Now, you don't have to take it from Chay Bowes. Go back and read the last U.S. State Department report into Ukraine, the country report from the U.S. State Department, and it will list in great detail the brutality and the corruption within Ukraine. So in order for the U.S. and with the collective West, if you like, and now particularly Europe, to back Ukraine and to turn its back on the fundamental principles which it says are being defended in Ukraine, is quite remarkable. Psychology, this is quite remarkable. That the idea that Europe, which founds its basic principles on freedom of movement, freedom of expression, freedom of the media, the rights of the individual, all of those things have been completely crushed in Ukraine by this dictatorship. And they've been crushed with European money and huge European political capital. There's no necessity anymore for European leaders to shake hands with Mr. Zelensky. He must be embraced now. There's no need to, suggest that we're going to support you on a road to peace. It seems that we're going to support you to maintain the war. The other thing that's very interesting, particularly among people who emanated from the left, like myself, I find myself becoming far more centrist or more right on some issues now as I get older. But people who came from the left, where's the anti-war movement in Ukraine? It's quite remarkable. Where is the anti-war movement? Where's the Labour Party? Where are the left when it comes to standing up for peace in Ukraine and challenging this very authoritarian regime? So much political capital, fiscal capital, money has been invested by people like Ursula von der Leyen, by this right, centre-right Christian coalition which governs Europe, which is now under serious threat because of this war, because of unbridled immigration, because of the really poor policies on these things. They have everything invested in this. They have everything to lose and nothing to gain from peace. I've often said it. Take Benjamin Netanyahu and take Vladimir Zelensky. What benefit would accrue to them by ending the wars in their countries? Firstly, Benjamin Netanyahu will have to face the corruption charges that he's been batting away because he's now the messiah of the Middle East. You know, he sees a wider Israel now. We're being told that Gaza will be absorbed into a wider Israel. It's a Lebensraum. Can you imagine from an Israeli prime minister? Meanwhile, Mr. Zelensky knows that if there is peace, and it's something that the Russians have demanded, in order for us to have peace in Ukraine, we would have to have an election within 100 days of the signing of that deal. Mr. Zelensky would then have to face the same corruption bodies he's tried to ban in the last month. He would have to face audits potentially from the United States, from the European Union, and even his own people he will have to face. A huge cadre of veterans, just like in Vietnam. But these men came back from the war disgruntled and disheartened and completely dismayed with what they've been asked to do. It had a huge impact on American society. You know this much more than me. Similarly, in Ireland, after peace, what do you do with these freedom fighters? What do we do with these men who are going to return to Kiev, to a rump state Kiev, which is an exquisitely corrupt country, exquisitely corrupt? So, can you imagine a situation where the biggest land war in Europe since the Second World War is being prevented from ending because the consequences for those protagonists that killed it are so grave? And they still manage to mobilize this idea that they are defending Europe from some sort of phantom Russian invasion. If Russia wanted to invade NATO, they wouldn't have taken Ukraine. They would have gone and taken Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in an afternoon. Estonia has an army of 7,000 men. One Russian battalion tactical group. Russia has 1 million men plus on the ranks now. They could just walk into one of these NATO countries. So you have to understand the reality. It's not Star Wars here, where it's actually good people and bad people. It's the massive military-industrial complex, which is predicated on this conflict, which is borne out by the collapse in Rheinmetall fears. As soon as they even talk about peace, the word peace is like garlic to a vampire when it comes to this massive investment, inward investment into the military-industrial complex in Europe. So you don't need to be a genius when you zoom out and say, there is zero benefit to accrue to the same elites who started this war and perpetuated to ending it. It's like the emperor's clothes will be revealed. You know, the curtain will drop in the. I like to use the analogy of the Wizard of Oz when Toto pulls the curtain back, and there's the fumbling old professor behind the curtain, operating the levers of this mighty facade. And that's what NATO and the European Union is essentially. It's a facade because they haven't really done anything for Ukraine except assist it in self-harming itself and assisted suicide in Ukraine.
You mentioned Ukraine and their losses on the battlefield, and that's something that's also never discussed in the media. It's really, remember in the beginning of the war when we were told that Russia was on its heels and they had essentially already lost and their goal was Kyiv, even though it never was. So they were like, look at this, Ukraine managed to repel them from attacking Kyiv. We need to support them. they're fighting, our fight essentially. And then I think Secretary Austin, Joe Biden's defense secretary, was like, well, our main goal is the strategic defeat of Russia, to weaken it. So it seems like we're beyond that at this point. But however, Ukraine does continue striking soft targets across Russia. And just like the other night, they launched one of their biggest drone strikes on the soft infrastructure. And it seems like every time that happens, Russia escalates, and then they get painted by the Western media as, "Look at Russia, they're attacking, Ukraine, and we need to stop this. This is Putin's an evil madman." Has that narrative, has the Western media and politicians lost that narrative in your mind?
Well, you have to understand that the Western media has centrally forged this narrative. It's very interesting. If you look back to 2022, when the Russians crossed the border, within 3 months, over a period of 2 days, all Western media, Washington Post, New York Times, the Independent, the Daily Mirror, the Daily Mail, all TV channels which are state funded, came up with this line, which rolls off the tongue so beautifully. Of course, it's a very easy one to remember: Russia's full-scale, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Okay, they all began to refer to this event on that basis, and that's subliminal messaging. It's very difficult. I don't blame people who live in a pickle of propaganda in the United States, in Europe. I don't blame them, because it's like, I use the analogy of the traffic light. When you drive down the street and you see a traffic light and it goes red, you presume there's danger, so you stop your car until it goes green, and then you move on. You don't know what's coming the other way, but you presume the traffic light is telling you the truth. In an analogy, it's very much the same with the legacy media. People believed the legacy media about COVID. They believed it about Vietnam, Black Americans. They believed it about Saddam Hussein was going to kill everybody in 45 minutes. They believed, that the Soviet Union was going to invade Europe, which never happened. They believed that everyone in their neighborhood was a communist if they had any kind of remote idea of maybe change society for the better against aggressive capitalist machine. So the media isn't about telling you the truth. And this is one of the very important things I like to say to people. The media's job is not to tell the truth. It's to send messages. It's a repeater station for the people who own the media. The people who own the media are intimately involved with the people who own the political infrastructure, particularly in the United States of America, a country where you need at least $1 billion if you want to become president. That money comes from somewhere. It comes from industry. And the industry that is predicated and makes most money from conflict and the fear of conflict, and a fear-based society where everyone needs to own a weapon, because you have to have somebody to fear: the immigrant, the black man, the Jew, the Muslim, the Irishman, and now the Russians are coming, apparently in 5 years. It's very simple to see the machine, the mechanism by which this happens. So the media is exceptionally complicit in what's happened in Ukraine. Now you start to see little drips, little slivers of light breaking through, particularly when Mr. Zelensky tried to shut down NABU, the Western-funded anti-corruption agency in Kiev. Now, people started to protest on the streets. This would have not been possible if Western embassies hadn't, as I've been informed by people on the ground, instructed Mr. Zelensky, don't you, under any circumstances, touch these protesters. It was a very organic-looking protest, but it was very much organized as well. So this was a committed protest, because the Americans knew what Mr. Zelensky was about to do, to close down the anti-corruption mechanism, which is basically, again, an intelligence repeater station for the CIA, based in Kiev. They're working with MI6 to control the flow of money in and out and keep an eye on Mr. Zelensky. Now, his actions in doing that show a huge amount of desperation, but I don't see anything changing in the media, because Donald Trump is in a very difficult situation when it comes to Ukraine, as you say, and Russia. How is he going to get out of this with a win? Right now, as far as the Democrats are concerned, and Mr. Trump's enemies, if Mr. Trump discovered a cure for cancer tomorrow, he would be accused of denying people suffering with cancer the right to be ill. This is how insane it's become. So even if the stop clock tells the right time twice a day and Donald Trump delivers some sort of peace in Ukraine, he will be then accused of being a Russian asset. The media will very quickly be mobilized against him to undermine him, as they were in 2016. Remember the Russia, the hoax that was there. I wonder sometimes how this goldfish memory of the public is deployed against them. It's like flashing lights and candy and sweet and sour. People are lured into this good guy, bad guy now. But people are fundamentally good, but they want to believe they're on the right side of things. They want to believe they're on the right side of a conflict between good and evil. But life is rarely that simple. And it's certainly not that simple when it comes to Ukraine. A very complex history of agitation against Russia, of pushing up against Russia, trying to deny Russia very important historical and geostrategic territory. And as Mr. Austin, who, by the way, was a shareholder and ex-senior executive in Raytheon Missiles, while still associated while Secretary of Defense, Mr. Austin, he didn't even try to hide it in the end. He said, we want to inflict a strategic uh, victory or defeat over Russia. And that has completely collapsed now. The strategic defeat has been inflicted on Europe. And Mr. Trump has done something very smart and very deft in saying, you want to continue this war? We'll sell you the weapons, but it's with your money, your war now. It's Joe Biden's war. So I think it's a very interesting dynamic to watch. Let's see what happens in the next 24 hours.
How is it like working as a reporter in Russia? Can you just explain to the viewers what it's like to be a reporter in Russia right now? The freedom of the press. Do you feel like you could report on anything and publish anything and be okay? Because Russia is like the big boogeyman when it comes to, at least in the U.S. we portray Russia as some kind of North Korea or something. Can you please describe what it's like being a Western journalist working in Russia? Are there any differences that you see?
Well, I don't mean this most sincerely. The only difference I have working in Russia as working in Europe is I can say what I want, particularly about Europe and Russia. I don't do a lot of work on Russia's internal politics. It's not my area of expertise. I've studied NATO and Russia, the military aspects of it, and Ukraine. That's my sort of area. I've never been asked not to say something. I've never been told to say something whatsoever. I'll do a polygraph. I mean, nobody's ever asked me what to say, not to say. Russians are very much interested, from the taxi driver, the guy in the street, to the professor of politics. People are very interested in politics here, very educated, very, very acutely aware of the great game that's been played. Personally, I've had no issues, but I have been deported from Europe. I went to Romania to report on the oppression of the election there when the wrong man was heading to become the president because he was leading in the polls, Calin Georgescu. He was the election of Calin Georgescu in Romania was banned with the assistance of the European Union, and they had to go to a second round. The second guy comes in, George Simeon. I went to report on that, and I landed on the plane in Bucharest Airport from Dublin. I'm a European citizen. My rights of freedom of movement are there. I'm a member of the International Federation of Journalists, the National Union of Journalists, and I'm on the plane. 6 anti-terrorist police came onto the plane, arrested me, took me off the plane, took my belongings, interrogated me, and informed me I was being deported from Romania as a threat to state security. Now, that never happened to me in Russia. No one's ever asked me a question walking in and out of the door of the airport here, other than the usual stuff. So ask yourself, where is the authoritarian regime? Russia, Russian media, Russia Today, which I work for as a correspondent, is banned in the European Union. It's banned in the United States. It's banned in many countries in the world. Why? Why would you ban it? I mean, if people like me are lying, why not debate with us and expose us as liars in open debate?
My last question to you and everyone who's watching this is Chay Bowes. You need to follow him on X. He gives you great updates about what's going on across the world with a great perspective. So that's Chay Bowes on X. Chay, again, thank you for joining us. I have one more question while I have you. I know we went a little over time. Is Trump's diplomatic skills, it's interesting how he went from saying that he's going to end the war in 24 hours, and then after that didn't happen, obviously, it looked like he really rejected Zelensky at the White House meeting, and that was a big brouhaha in Washington, and Lindsey Graham even came out against Zelensky. But then after that, it looks like he got disenfranchised with Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, that is. And it looked like he got frustrated. At one point, he posted "stop" on social media to Putin because he was bombing Kiev. Could Trump, do you think, does he have a rabbit to pull out of this hat? Does his almost bipolar approach to diplomacy, could this serve as a benefit to him? That it's something Russia might not be used to? They really don't know where he's coming from. And could this be a strategic advantage to Trump to some degree going into the negotiations, repositioning nuclear submarines right before getting into words with Dmitry Medvedev? Is Trump so outrageous that this could be a net benefit to the U.S. or in Ukraine in negotiations?
Look, I mean, a moving target, is what Mr. Trump is. But I think the Russians, first of all, consider their position. And I recently tweeted, I said, it doesn't really matter what Mr. Trump threatens, what he says, or what he's not going to say. Russians are only interested in maintaining course, with their position. Because they have an electorate, they have a society here which is at war to a great extent, although Russia's never declared war on Ukraine. So I think Russians are generally fond of Mr. Trump, actually. And they're actually grateful to him for actually sitting down with him and actually addressing the Russian president with some respect and not falling into this idiotic, castigation of this caricature of Donald Trump, someone who lives in a volcano and eats pickled Ukrainian babies for breakfast. I mean, there's a sense of respect towards Americans. And there's a great yearning in Russia here for détente between Russia and America. There's a great fondness for America. So many Russians live there. So such great history. Remember, Russia and America fought back to back against the Nazis. Many would suggest that the Fourth Reich is being funded at the moment in Europe and in Ukraine, which is quite remarkable. So there's a huge history. There's a huge sense of warmth, I think, in Russia towards the Americans. But there's also now a sense of skepticism after the Biden government's aggressive attempts to escalate, giving weapons to Ukraine to attack Russian cities, denying the truth about the Ukrainian war crimes from 2014 onwards, Azov Battalion, IDAR. OECD reports clearly show what they were doing in eastern Ukraine. So this selective a la carte history, which is deployed then as Mr. Trump is a madman, rolls out of a volcano, takes a pin in a map, and you're next. It's just this cartoon book idiocy, which was aggressively promoted by Mr. Biden, who we now know is paid not really at the wheel, and Anthony Blinken, etc., before you knew it. We don't have to go back to that story again. I think Mr. Trump's pragmatism, let's call it, let's be kind to call it pragmatism, okay, is a strength. And I think that's what the Europeans and the British, particularly, and the British, remember, are one of the most aggressive protagonists for this war continuing in Ukraine. Boris Johnson ending the peace talks in 2022, which would have finished this war. And you talked about the Russians being chased out of Kiev. The Russians pulled back a 50-kilometer long, line of armor away from Kiev because of that the deal. They were told there wouldn't be a deal, and part of that would be pulled back. They did that, and then the Ukraine said, "Oh no, we're going to keep fighting." After Boris Johnson insisted on that, and that's been accepted. So, Mr. Trump's pragmatism is, of course, something that the Russians are aware of. And again, if you factor in his ego, his necessity to get a deal, and of course, there's a bigger fish here, which most people aren't talking at all about, which is the potential value of economic cooperation between Russia and the United States. In security sense, number one, but also number two, economically. The northern regions in Alaska, this is not an accident that these guys are meeting in Alaska. Once a Russian territory, in the 1860s became American, sold for $7.2 million, by the way. You guys got a great deal, $150 million in today's money. So there is scope, and there is a chance of a deal. Who would you bet on in this card game? And as I said to George Galloway the other day, Trump, his team, Sergei Lavrov, Vladimir Putin, the chess players on one side, and these kind of guys, who want things to happen fast. It seems the Trump administration has been all about fast. Bring me the next executive order, signing them, boom, boom, boom. Now the fact that 60% plus of them never get implemented because they get held up in the court doesn't matter, because this is theater. This is Mr. Trump showing the world, I have the power. I can bring rain to the desert. So I think the guiding engine of momentum in these peace talks will probably be Mr. Trump's ego. I mean, it's disappointing to say that, but if the Russians can see that and still attain and garner what they need from this, and the Russian position hasn't changed at all, and it won't change. It can't change. Vladimir can't come back from the deal and say, "Oh yeah, I've changed my mind. These four regions are not now constitutionally part of the Russian Federation." It's just never going to happen in a million years. And the other thing I'll end on that will certainly not happen is the Russians will never, ever agree to a ceasefire without a wider deal. It just isn't going to happen. This idea that the Russians will stop, let the Ukrainian army off the ropes where they are now, getting pummeled, in order for them to rearm, to turn around and do what they did in April 2022, when they said, we'll sign the deal. The deal was signed in April 2022. And that's a guy called David Arhamiev from Zelensky's party admitted that we signed the deal and the British came and tore up the paper and said, you're going to fight on. So it's very clear what the Russian position is. It's whether or not Mr. Trump's ego overrides the mechanisms by which he's being influenced from his partners in Europe.
Chay Bowes, thank you so much for joining the Trends Journal today. And again, I implore everyone to go to X and check out Chay Bowes. Just look him up and you can find his X handle, Chay. Thank you for joining the Trends Journal. I appreciate it.
Pleasure.